So I'm going to start again. I already showed you this, different types of non-accidental injury. The area that's a little bit lacking in veterinary medicine as far as understanding what happens, especially with blunt force trauma case, is what's called biomechanics. It's the branch of physics that describes the effects of intrinsic and extrinsic physiological and non-physiological forces on living tissue. And then obviously the type of tissue is important as well. So injuries may injuries may result, as I said earlier, from the impact of an animal's body against a blunt surface or the impact of an object with a blunt surface against the animal's body. Force applied to tissue, biologic tissue, can cause blunt force trauma injuries. There are three mechanisms that cause injury. This doesn't matter. This isn't different. It's regardless of whether it's a motor vehicle accident or physical abuse. There's excessive energy transfer, there's acceleration, deceleration injuries, and then there's direct physical disruption of tissue at the impact site, where there is the impact site. And that's what most people think about, but as veterinarians know, if an animal gets hit in the rear end by a car, that doesn't mean it's not going to have pulmonary contusions or a pneumothorax, because the movement of that animal's body in space and then hitting the ground can cause injury. So there has to be motion. The energy of motion is kinetic energy, and when the impact occurs, the body has to absorb that energy. There's something called conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. That's the first law of thermodynamics. That's all the physics I know. But it explains why, if there's significant energy at the time of impact and the body has to absorb that energy, why it can be injured, because sometimes it's just an overwhelming amount of energy. The more energy would cause greater injury. Also, a blunt object, the size of the object and impact area vary. And so a blunt object with a smaller surface area delivers energy to a smaller area of the body than a blunt object with a larger surface area. If the energy of impact is focused on a smaller area, it's less efficiently absorbed and dissipated by tissue than occurs with an impact of the same size force to a larger area, where that energy is spread over a larger area of tissue. So the result is more severe tissue disruption with a smaller surface area blunt object. That's the explanation for why rib fractures are so common in physical abuse. Animals are kicked, they're hit. When you get a car hitting an animal, it's a broad application of force. And there was a study done at UPenn in the 70s, 600 motor vehicle accidents, and 600 animals, and out of the 600 animals, 18 or 3% had rib fractures. So it's not common. It's also not common with high rises. Again, it's when the cat, in the urban environments, cats falling out of windows, when their body hits the ground, it's a broad application of force. You do see significant thoracic organ injury. You'll see pulmonary contusions, hemothorax. You can see a hemoabdomen, liver lacerations cause a problem. But rib fractures are not common. And there have been studies that detail the type of injuries like that. Study from UPenn, the author's name is Kolata, K-O-L-A-T-A, and showed that the percentage of rib fractures is not high in motor vehicle accidents. And I showed you the study we did with Tufts, and it was similar. Almost a third of our animals have rib fractures, and I've showed you a number of cases also. Force equals mass times acceleration. That's a picture of Isaac Newton. When a force is applied to a body, it accelerates in space. That's Newton's second law. With the application of force, all tissue organs of the body experience acceleration. Different organs have different masses and accelerate at different rates. They do not move en masse in an organized fashion. And then when the body hits the ground, it's a sudden stop, and you still have motion of the internal organs. And you get problems where there are avulsions, at fixed attachment points. Blood vessels can be torn, that kind of thing. Liver lacerations, pulmonary lacerations and contusions, brain contusions. So all of that can happen without a direct impact at the site. There are cases where the medical findings don't support animal cruelty, and that's just fine. So this is a young Shih Tzu type dog. The owner said that the dog fell out of his hands, and there's a fracture. It's a transverse fracture of the femur. I called a veterinarian who wrote an article on biomechanics in the veterinary clinics of North America. It was interesting because we were focused on the fracture, and he said, well, what does the soft tissue look like? Is it swollen? You know, there was almost no tissue swelling associated with the injured site on the leg. And is it bruised? The bruising was medial, not lateral. Imagine if somebody kicked the dog. In most instances, he's going to kick the outside of the dog's leg. And there's going to, if he kicks it hard enough and you're going to get a fracture, there's going to be some significant soft tissue swelling. But he said, actually, this is probably exactly what the guy said. The dog fell out of his arms, and you ended up with a transverse fracture. The impact could have been that there was energy transferred up the leg to the femur and caused the fracture. So. I mentioned this earlier, the battered animal syndrome, based on the Kempe article from JAMA in 1962. Helen Munro, the UK pathologist, wrote The Battered Pet in that American Humane Association guide. She also wrote a series of 4 articles a little later on animal cruelty. They're a good group of articles to get your hands on. Here's a cat. We've seen this a number of times. Abnormal posture, young cat that just literally will stand like that on the table, doesn't need any restraint because it's got a traumatic brain injury. It's got sedate behavior, anisocoria. It also had 2 healed rib fractures, the right and left 13th ribs. That's the radiograph on the bottom. So previous trauma in this cat, the right side of its face was swollen and the scruff of its neck was thickened. So this cat had experienced significant, it didn't go outside, it's an indoor cat. Significant traumatic injury, but evidence of previous injury with those healing fractured ribs. I talked about duration and timeline previously. So what we use for that, histopathology is used for wound healing, that dog with the embedded chain. We also have found hemosiderin in cases. It takes time for hemoglobin to be metabolized to hemosiderin, so that couldn't happen during, in the couple of cases we had, there were both deceased animals, couldn't happen during the fatal event. And then a lot of radiography, looking at fracture callus formation. You've seen some of those, fracture fragment remodeling, and then something about duration is told by disuse atrophy of muscles and the muscle mass decreases. This is Chibi, 6-month-old puppy, was at the New York City shelter. The ASPCA went there. It's a young, very adoptable dog, simply has a distal right femoral fracture. There was no explanation as to the cause of the injury, and Chibi was brought to us so that we could repair the leg and then adopt him out. So there on the left is the femur fracture, but then the middle radiograph showed 2 healing rib calluses, and then pelvic radiograph showed that there were FHOs. This is a 5-month-old puppy on both hind legs, and the question is why? So law enforcement was able to get a hold of the person, and this Chibi had bilateral FHOs at another veterinary hospital in New York, and we got those medical records. On September 18th, Chibi was brought in. It was said that pots and pans fell on him the previous evening. He had a left hind lameness. An NSAID was prescribed, and they said, if he doesn't get better, bring him back and we'll do some radiographs. And he did come back, but now he came back because he couldn't use either hind leg. And the individual said, my roommate did something bad, and law enforcement was called. And for some reason, it didn't go forward as a case at that point. These are the radiographs that were taken on October 8th. So again, there weren't radiographs on September 18th, but it shows fractures of both femurs. So as you might remember, the September 18th injury, it was the left hind leg. If you look at those arrows at the bottom, it shows significantly decreased thigh muscle mass for the left hind leg because that's the leg that was injured on September 18th, and it would have been the femoral neck fracture, and there's evidence of healing, remodeling of bone. There's that very white sclerotic area. So that's what happened on September 18th. Then he came in on October 8th, and that was a recent right femoral fracture. The edges are nice and clean. There's no bone remodeling. The muscle mass of that leg has not decreased at that point. So that's the beginning of creating a timeline for him. Here's a close-up showing the two femoral neck fractures. So here's the final timeline. September 18th, left femoral neck fracture. October 8th, right femoral neck fracture. On October 8th, the person bringing it in did say something that the roommate was responsible for some reason. It didn't go anywhere. On October 25th, they called again to say that they need to bring Chibi in as soon as possible, and that's when Chibi had the right distal femoral fracture. So here are three major traumatic events for this dog. They did not show up at that animal hospital, but they did leave Chibi at the city shelter on October 29th. We took him on November 1st and saw those healed rib fractures. They could have occurred at either of those previous events, either on October 8th or September 18th. This time, law enforcement pursued this with all the information we got, and as it turned out, the individual hurting Chibi was an Iraq War veteran who had severe PTSD and was not getting the care that she needed for that. And so as a result of this happening, Chibi benefited because he got additional care that he needed and was adopted out, and then she got the care that she needed. The positive side of man's relationship is epitomized by the human-animal bond. It's actually a dog that was an abuse case many years previously, big bad Cane Corso. The negative side can be seen in the link between violence to people and animals. The link between human interpersonal violence and animal abuse, there can be one individual, one violent individual responsible for abusing multiple vulnerable individuals, animals, children, partners, families, friends, domestic violence, domestic disputes, the elderly and disabled individual. There are two studies I'm going to show you. The first was done with 38 women, victims of domestic violence seeking shelter. Their age range was 20 to 51 years of age. Those are the partner relationships, 57% married, 3% separated, divorced and single. 28 or 3/4 of these women currently have pets or had pets in the past. Of this group, 71% reported that their pets had been threatened, hurt, or killed by the batterer. And 16 said that their pets were actually harmed. So there were a number of studies done like this. This is a 2-year-old male Cavalier King Charles Spaniel that was killed. It was a husband and wife, lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He killed the dog, and then he called his wife to tell her he killed the dog. For some reason, he bathed the dog. She came home and made him go with her to the veterinary hospital. This is 2003, so a while ago. At that time, in the animal hospital, he confessed in front of the veterinarian that he killed the dog. The veterinarian called the Department of Health because he had been bitten when he killed the dog to report a dog bite. It was fortunately late Friday afternoon, and the Department of Health was not going to pick the dog's body up that day. So he kept it, because it was a small dog, refrigerated over the weekend. And then they did come to pick the dog up on Monday, and they were going to test the dog for rabies, and that was all that was going to happen. The dog walker found out about this and flagged down an ASPCA vehicle. The ASPCA cops went to the city shelter where the dog's body was and seized the dog's body. And then when I showed up at work on Tuesday, I had a necropsy to do. And all day long on Tuesday, I kept getting calls from the Department of Health that they wanted to test this dog for rabies. At that time, there hadn't been a case of rabies in New York City in 40 years. The dog did not leave New York and had been vaccinated 3 times by a very good vaccine. So rabies was really not a possibility. I did the necropsy. There were 3 distinct areas of hemorrhage on the dog's head, 3 separate blows to the head. The blow to the top of the head is consistent with the dog being kicked in the head. It was forceful enough to remove the top layer of skin. And there was also brain hemorrhage. There were fractured ribs. There was massive, that's the underside of the dog. That's sort of its back end there, its inguinal area. With massive internal hemorrhage. And the conclusion at that time was that there was enough blood loss that by itself could have been fatal. There was also the brain injury. So this is the different injuries that were found. Recent fractures of left ribs 12 and 13. That probably happened during the fatal event. There was a bony callus of the 9th rib. That's a healed fracture that was by the radiologist believed to be 4 to 6 weeks old or older. So there was a previous traumatic event. There was fibrosis or scarring on the surface of the liver and the kidney. That was histopathology. The estimate it would take at least a week to form that. So there was another traumatic event that was identified. And there was hemosiderin identified associated with the liver, kidney, and also the lung. So this wasn't the first time that the dog was beaten. And one of the things that I take home from this is it's frequently assumed that if a person gets bit by a dog, that the dog is the aggressor. But in this case, I think the dog was defending itself. So that's the assumption people frequently make, and it's good to correct that. And it will happen at trial. There's a discussion or questions that are asked that seem to indicate that, you know, the person was bit during the event. That doesn't mean that the person didn't hit the dog first. 5 years after this case, I got a call from the wife. She was a victim of domestic violence. She was finally divorcing this guy. She wanted a copy of the necropsy to report to show that he was violent, and he was a physician. This case, this guy killed this little kitten. It was a 2-month-old Siamese kitten. Nasal bone and mandible fractures. There was a traumatic brain injury, pulmonary contusions, pneumothorax, 3 rib fractures. It's hard to break ribs in a kitten. They're very elastic. You know, they're meant to bend. It's a going animal. It's like trying to bend a sapling over your knee, not a woody tree branch. Liver lacerations and a right femoral neck fracture. This is from the Assistant District Attorney. The judge pled out the case today. He made the defendant an offer of 45 days incarceration, exchanged for a plea to New York State, that's Agriculture and Markets Law 353, misdemeanor animal cruelty. The defendant took the plea. He was apologetic. It's not the maximum amount, but at least it is some small amount of justice for the kitten. The woman, who was a victim of domestic violence, left to live in Florida with her family when her abuser was incarcerated. She would not testify against her abuser. That's not uncommon. I found this out because we do trainings at the police academy for NYPD, and the detective who investigated this case came up to let me know that she took advantage of him being incarcerated to leave. We've seen this a number of times now where the prosecution for the human assault, for the human interpersonal violence doesn't go forward because for a lot of reasons, very complicated situation, the woman won't testify against her abuser. But we're being successful with the animal cruelty part. So this is one of the reasons I believe that local police should be the responders for animal crime, because they're also the responders for all violent offenders, including domestic violence. In terms of numbers, we've seen about 60 cases now since January of 2014 where there was an animal part of a domestic violence or domestic dispute case. And we do really well with the prosecution for the animal cruelty. That would not be happening if it was still our humane law group that took care of the animal part and the police didn't take care of the animal part, because my sense was previously not being responsible for animal cruelty in the city, nothing happened with the animal part. Animal abuse has also been associated with child abuse. This is a study done in New Jersey in the 1980s. There were 53 families with documented child abuse, which could be physical, psychological, sexual, or neglect. There was animal abuse in 60% or 32 of these families. If you separated out the cases where the child was physically abused and there was a pet in the family, it rose to almost 90% of those pets were being abused. Something that's interesting to us at this point in New York City is we're not seeing these cases. We're seeing a lot of domestic violence with an animal part. We're not seeing child abuse cases, and we don't know why at this point, but one of the considerations is just the way child abuse is handled. There's an Administration for Children's Services, and maybe they're the first step along the way when there's child abuse. And because the NYPD is not the primary responder, maybe that animal part is being lost. But it's definitely been documented that there's as much an association between animal abuse and child abuse as there is between animal abuse and domestic violence. So we're going to look into that a bit. We're doing a study looking at all of our domestic violence cases. We're going to put that together as a presentation, and then we're going to reach out to the different groups in the city that deal with child abuse and try to get a sense of why we're not seeing those cases. Yes, you have a question? Right. Could everybody hear that? So she has a case where she has a dog that came out of a child abuse situation, and it was a teacher that identified that there was something going on in the home. So the advantage of adding the animal part is it just enhances law enforcement, and the person gets charged with an additional crime. He's obviously a violent person. And that would be the benefit of PD wanting to pursue that part of it. Yes? That's the question is, in families where there is animal abuse and there are children, are the adults responsible? I think this is correct. Are the adults responsible or the children? And that would be for law enforcement to determine, and it can be difficult for them to determine that. But it's that is sort of something that's happened is this link between interpersonal human violence and animal abuse has all happened on the human side, meaning the work that's been done. It hasn't been done by veterinarians at this point. That's why what's going on in New York is so interesting. We have an opportunity now to say, yes, we understand that there's this connection, but this is what's actually happening to the animals. So for instance, we did a preliminary survey and we found out, and that was last year, early last year when we only had 20 cases, but half of the animals had been killed. So nobody knows that at this point. And the importance of communicating that kind of information is that if law enforcement knows that and they have a case of domestic violence and they don't see any animals around, they may not ask about animals. But if they know that that could be a part of what's going on, then they'll start asking that. And it should be asked, obviously, in child abuse cases also. So that's something we're looking to do with being able to collect the animal information at this part in a way that it hasn't previously been collected. Charlotte. Charlotte was a big story in New York City. She's a little Maltese-type dog. On August 28th, Charlotte was with her new family. She was a couple of months old, and this is her first visit to the doctor. This is an interesting animal hospital. It's on Staten Island, and they record every visit. So we've never had the amount of information about this one little dog is pretty remarkable. And I hope this works. Yes. It's just a snippet of the exam. But you can see her walking around. Obviously, there's a child involved. That's a huge concern. It will be a huge concern. So that's on August 28th. She comes back 2 weeks later to the hospital. She's lying on her side with a broken leg, and she's unable to stand and relatively unresponsive. So that's the veterinarian examining her. The child is not with the mother at this point. That's the mother, and she is the perpetrator. The veterinarian wanted to do more diagnostic work and provide the dog with care, and it was declined. This is the Animal Health Veterinary Group on Staten Island. The owner refused all medical treatment advice. She refused euthanasia. She wants to go home and exchange the dog for another dog at the pet store. She doesn't think the puppy is suffering and thinks it may get better in a few days. Euthanasia was declined, as I said, and the conversation was witnessed by, I don't know whose the initials that are. The story was actually that she was away for 10 days, and when she came back, the dog was already injured. It took her 3 days to bring the dog to the veterinary hospital. So the kinds of things I communicated to the district attorney is, number one, you come home, if your dog is like that, you don't wait 3 days to bring it to a veterinary hospital. That was her first opportunity to help the dog. She failed at that. Second opportunity is when the veterinarian said this dog needs care, and she declined care, and she took the dog with her. 8 hours later, Charlotte was found in a garbage bag on the side of the road in Staten Island. 2 women and a man heard her crying, and it took them an hour to find her. So they're standing next to their car off the side of the road, and this guy who's an EMT and going to college and coming home from class sees them, and it's just in his nature to help everybody he can. So he stops, he goes to look at the dog, he says, this dog needs medical care, I'll bring it to the animal hospital. It's South Shore Animal Hospital, which is one of the 24-hour hospitals we work with. So he drives it to South Shore. And that's Charlotte, and she's got a little pink bow in her hair, which becomes important in the case. It was such an unusual story. Find a dog in a garbage bag. At that point, she had a skull fracture and a traumatic brain injury in addition to the broken leg that had been seen 8 hours earlier in the day. It was such an unusual story that the Staten Island Advance, which is a local paper in Staten Island, decided to put it on their website. As a result of the fact that the manager, one of the office managers at the first veterinary hospital where she was brought with a broken leg, recognized her because of that bow. And she says, I know who that dog belongs to. And so she notified the police, and they went and they arrested the woman. She had already gone to the pet store and gotten another puppy. That was the next day. So this woman is a sociopath. We've talked a bit about domestic violence cases, that connection. There are people that just hurt animals, and we see not as many of them as the domestic situations, but we see enough. When she was brought to South Shore between 8 and 9 p.m. that night, she had bruising on either side of her head, signs of a traumatic brain injury. She deteriorated overnight. Once NYPD got involved, we got involved, and we requested that she be moved to the Animal Medical Center, which has a neurology department. And she was under intensive care at the Animal Medical Center 5 days with what's called syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. So her water levels went up, her sodium went down, and they had to supplement her with very high levels of sodium and monitor her very carefully so that when her brain started working again and this syndrome disappeared, they knew immediately and would reduce the levels of sodium she was being supplemented with. So here's another 3D CT that the Animal Medical Center did in one of our cases. That's the skull fracture across the frontal bone. And then that line, that's a slice off of the back of her head because that fracture line is deep to the surface of her head, of the top of the surface of her skull. And you can see the bruising on her head there. There's the fracture that she showed up with the first time that day at the Animal Health Group in Staten Island. This became a big media story. It was like a Tom Wolfe novel. If any of you have ever read Bonfire of the Vanities, it was just like that. There was protests every time this woman showed up at court. There were protests where she lived. And the Staten Island Advance wrote 70 stories on this over the course of a year. She did well. She has some continuing neurologic problems, but she was adopted by a veterinarian and is getting great care. And she's been renamed Pip. There was a bench trial. Again, that means that she declines to have a jury, and so it will be the judge who determines whether or not she's guilty. All the newspaper stories were great. So they said, you know, these are the 5 key, this is all taken from the newspaper. These are the 5 key players in the trial. I worked with the assistant district attorneys Adam Silberlight and Jane Grimberg, and they're great. They have now established in Staten Island that those two are going to handle all animal cruelty cases. And they've done the same in Queens, so 2 of the 5 boroughs now have distinct animal cruelty parts of the district attorney's offices. She's found guilty. She's found guilty of aggravated animal cruelty, that's the felony level animal cruelty, misdemeanor animal cruelty, and animal abandonment. She's sentenced to a year in jail. She's also banned from owning a companion animal for 15 years. She must register in the Animal Abuse Registry for 5 years. That's in New York City. They have a new animal abuse registry if you're convicted of felony animal cruelty in order to pay the ASPCA $22,000 in restitution. I don't know how they work that out. Yes? Question?
The restitution presumably for medical care?
Yes.
So even though the dog is technically evidence and the police are medical?
We pay the cost of care in the city. The NYPD does not pay the cost of care. That was sort of the question, is who's paying for what? The ASPCA pays for care for these animals, and NYPD takes care of all of their part of the case, but we do the animal part as far as finances. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you know what happened to the daughter?
No, but I know that there was a custody fight, and that had actually started before the trial, I think the summer before the trial. It took about a year for it to go to trial. Yes?
The other puppy that was there the day they showed up?
They took the other puppy, the NYPD took that day when they arrested her, yeah. Any other questions? So the New York City Animal Abuse Registry was formed in 2014 by the City Council. So things are progressing. We have a few minutes. Do we have a few minutes? I'm going to really quickly, I just want to expose you to this. This will be available to you, whatever the link is that you get for these. But I wanted to talk a little bit about dogfighting, and then we'll be done. This is my definition of dogfighting. It's a set of circumstances that creates an opportunity for violent individuals to abuse animals and conduct other criminal activity. These are the type of crimes that are charged when there is a dogfighting operation. So obviously dogfighting, frequently animal cruelty is added on to that because animals have been injured and not properly cared for. Illegal gambling, illicit drugs, illegal firearms, child abuse if a child is brought to that situation and exposed to that, and practicing veterinary medicine without a license. These are a couple of resources for you. There's the animal.law Michigan State website that I mentioned earlier. They have a great discussion on dogfighting. And then there is what's called the dogfighting toolkit that you can send for, and they'll send you. It's a nice text. It's actually sort of a similar format to that Minnesota guide that I showed you earlier, but it's on dogfighting. The largest dogfighting case we've had in this city was in June 2012 before the formal ASPCA NYPD partnership, but we're involved, NYPD was involved, and it was actually initiated out of the Bronx District Attorney's Office. And that was an undercover operation that went on for 12 months. They presented themselves, the undercover police, as dog fighters. They were buying puppies from the alleged dog fighter. This is how dogs are kept in an urban environment. They're warehoused. They sit in cages, usually stacked 3 high, and they live in those cages 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They do not get out for any reason other than if they're training for a fight or if they're fighting. And there are puppies that are kept in those cages as well. So we do a lot of photography, and we also do a wound scar chart to show the distribution, because it's standard distribution in a dog out of an organizing dog fighting situation where the bite wounds are all focused on the front of the body. There's just nothing on the back end of the body. And if 2 dogs get into a fight, just, not really organized dog fighting, they'll just bite each other everywhere. So when you see that in dog after dog after dog, it's, again, circumstantial evidence that this is a dog fighting situation. I wanted to show you this because frequently you'll see the dog as it is on December 6th. This is probably a little earlier than this dog with heel, but this dog came to the animal hospital, not part of the Bronx dogfighting setup, but I just want to show you the picture. That's what this dog got into a fight. It was not known. The circumstances weren't known, so it didn't go anywhere as a case, but it's up to the veterinarian to communicate that that's what the dog looks like and how badly it's injured at the time that it actually is in the fight. This is what a fighting pit looks like. That's blood spatter all over the walls. We'll do swabs of that blood spatter. We'll do buccal swabs of the dogs. The fighting dogs. We'll submit them to VGL at UC Davis, and they'll actually match the DNA from the walls of the fighting pit and the dogs, basically placing the dogs in the fighting pit. So this is that day in the Bronx. Whoops. That carpet, if you wouldn't know, wouldn't look like anything, but that carpet is actually the fighting pit, and there's part of the plywood wall of the fighting pit. We can use one of the agents that makes blood fluoresce, and so all of that fluorescence is blood from the fighting pit that was reconstructed to provide evidence at trial. We do summaries of the animals. There were 50 dogs. There was excessive scarring in 17 total, or 34%, recent wounds in 14%, 10% were anemic, 14% were dehydrated. Intestinal parasitism wasn't a big problem. We do Babesia PCR. There's a special species of Babesia gibsoni, that is endemic in the dogfighting population, primarily pit bulls in this country. And there were 8 out of the 50 that were infected. We've been doing Babesia PCRs since 2007, that was 5 years later, on all pit bulls that come through, fighting and non-fighting dogs. And the infection rate on the non-fighting dogs, which was close to 200 dogs at that point, was 4%. So again, circumstantial evidence, but this is 4 times the infection rate in this group of dogs than in our group of 200 non-fighting dogs that we have been keeping track of for 5 years. This is how dogs are kept in a rural environment. They live on the end of a very heavy chain. Usually it's about 10 feet long. That's the only shelter they have. This was in Georgia in February, where the temperatures were freezing. There was no potable water available, or it was frozen. A lot of them were underweight. Interestingly to me, I always assumed that a dog fighter would take good care of his dogs, but it depends on what it's for. This is a breeding operation, and they do not take good care of the dogs. As long as they produce puppies for them, they're fine. We had a recent case that I wanted to present, but I can't for legal reasons at this point. But this guy was basically breeding 2 dogs that were disabled. They basically couldn't walk anymore because of the injuries they sustained during fighting. But to him, they were very good fighting dogs, so he was still breeding these 2 dogs. But they do not care for these animals at all. You know, they don't have any sympathy for their injuries. To them, they're just a way. It's this activity of dog fighting, making money, that whole bit. But they could care less about the way these dogs live. That's all I have for you today. Thank you.